Hello, and welcome now as we come to the fifth Sunday of the Easter season. Our readings this time, and again, really kind of follow a pattern that we've been developing over the last few weeks. The first reading comes from the book of Acts, chapter 14, verses 21 through 27. The second reading comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verses 1 through 5a. And the gospel comes from the 13th chapter of John's Gospel, verses 31 through 33a, and then 34, 35. There's a little skipping for some reason of part of that verse. This time, the episode that we hear in the gospel is part of Jesus' homily to his or talk, or dialogues, however you want to put it, to his disciples on the night of the Last Supper. Now, in the story that we hear, or in the episode that we're going to hear, at the supper, Judas has just departed. So in verse 31a, he has gone or left, and in typical Johannine imagery, points out that it was night. But of course he means, night is characterized by darkness, and of course this is an important theme throughout the Johannine gospel of light and darkness. So if in a certain way Judas has now left, darkness is going to begin to have its power or its influence. So all of that a little bit lies behind this reading. Now, Jesus is here pictured as alone with his disciples, who, for all their weaknesses, are soon to be compared, at least to the fact that they will remain loyal and devoted to Jesus. Now, the gospel writer points out that this is the moment when Jesus now will enter into his glory. We have noticed on other occasions, and again, we have to pay attention to the fact that this is the Johannine gospel. It is very different in its, as we have noted on a number of occasions, with its outlook and with its position from the other three gospel writers, the synoptics. Now, also keep in mind here that there is a tension within the Johannine community, and we have pointed this out on other occasions, and it's important to notice here that by the time that this gospel is written, there is a real tension between the Johannine community, who have accepted Jesus, and the larger Jewish community. And that's always very important in the language and in the way in which things are structured. The glorification of Jesus now is to again notice his relationship throughout this gospel to the Father. The glorification of Jesus will take place in this gospel, as we have noted on other occasions, on Calvary. It is there that the great events that connect us with Jesus and his life are manifested. So in this gospel, Calvary is understood in a very different way, well, at least a different way from that of the other evangelist. But it is there on the cross that Jesus is glorified. Now, it's difficult to know exactly what to stress here in this regard. Let me back it up by saying, again, something that is very important to keep in mind, that we are looking at the Mediterranean culture. We need to judge things by their terms, not by modern terms. And as we have noted in the Mediterranean culture, honor is a public claim to worth or value, and it is a public recognition and acknowledgement of that claim. So, what is Jesus' claim to worth or to honor in this passage? Namely, his intimate death, in which he will be obeying the command of the Father. This takes us back to some episodes found in chapter 10, where Jesus claims the honor of being the obedient Son of the Father. In this gospel and in this world, and we have noted some of these qualities before, a stoic acceptance of death validates Jesus' claim. Therefore, he reflects a Mediterranean manliness, and it marks him as the son who has learned his Father's lesson well. Now, keep in mind again in this gospel that the writer clearly indicates that Jesus is the divine one, the divine Son. And this intimate relationship, which we've noted on other occasions throughout this gospel, is between the Father and Jesus. So, Jesus here makes a claim to have personal power to lay down his life and to pick it up again. And this honorable power has been given to him by the Father, and he honors the Father by doing this. Furthermore, Jesus claims to have personal power, he himself, to lay down his life and to pick it up again. One finds this indicated in chapter 10, verse 18 of John's Gospel, and it is by doing this an honorable power given by the Father. Thus, Jesus demonstrates his personal honor, and he also does the honor of his Father. So there's this continued close relationship, as I've mentioned. God the Father is honored by his Son's spontaneous and unquestioning obedience, even unto death. But God's greatest honor and claim resides in raising his Son from the dead. So keep in mind that there is a shamefulness to dying on the cross, a shamefulness to die in the way that Jesus did. And yet, because of this, as I mentioned, this kind of stoic attitude, it is something that the Greek thinkers often saw as an important value. To stand firm, to not give in, if you want, to tears, to moaning, to groaning, to complaining, but to accept it, is really, when you look at John's story of Jesus here, what he does. He doesn't complain, he doesn't give in, but rather indicates that everything he is doing is for the sake of the Father, and that the Father, despite the shamefulness, if you want, of the execution on the cross, by raising Jesus from the dead, will bring certainly to a conclusion the fact that there is great honor here by the action that Jesus does. So, what this episode does is it totally reverses the shameful dimension of the crucifixion, demonstrates that God did not abandon his Son, a just person, to eternal, that Jesus, a just person, to eternal shame and oblivion, but that bestows a marvelous honor on Jesus in raising him to life. So what we're saying here is, and that all of this is kind of background to this little episode, that as Jesus is here telling his disciples what is going to happen, that this contains or connects what we call the glory of God. Now, where had the glory of God been revealed? If one goes to examine a little bit this term, keep in mind that this writer often uses Old Testament understandings, is quite familiar with the Hebrew Bible. And so the glory of God was revealed to Israel in the Exodus events. As Israel stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, it was there that the glory of God was revealed. And it will be shown, the glory of God, in the death of Jesus, as I mentioned, upon the cross. The glory is brought about by the forces of darkness to which Judas is now aligned. But the glorification can be spoken of as a single process, embracing past, present, and future, not to be fully eclipsed until the Son returns to the glory he shared with the Father before the foundation of the world, in this chapter, verse 24. So always keep in mind, it is what we would call a descending theology that is developed by the gospel writer. Namely, what does it mean? We know from the beginning who Jesus is. Again, you go to the opening words of this gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then in that opening prologue, the Word became flesh, descended. So that's why it's called a descending Christology. We already know who Jesus is. In some ways, we know what his mission here on earth will be. And that ultimately, when all things are done, he will return to that position of glory that he shares with the Father. So keep in mind, he kind of comes down and then returns. That's a kind of theology, as we've mentioned, that is developed by this gospel writer. So glorification can then be seen or spoken of as a single process, embracing, as I mentioned, past, present, and future, not to be fully eclipsed until the Son returns to the glory that he shares with the Father. So keep in mind, we have mentioned that. Now, Jesus says to his disciples that he's going away to where they will be unable to follow. More immediately, and again, this going away, notice as I think have indicated a number of times that in the Johannine Gospel you can have layers of meaning about certain statements that are made, either by Jesus or by others in this Gospel. Jesus is going away can be more immediately connected with his going to his death, or it can be more ultimately his returning to the Father. So in both ways he will be, or in both instances, he will be going away from his disciples. All right. If in times this gets a little mixed, it is a difficult, and those who interpret this section of the gospel to really quite clearly put into place. So if I am a little confusing, keep in mind, well, I like to think I'm with some of the better scholars, but they're a little clearer than I perhaps am at here. All right. Now, what is another Old Testament background here? Might be to keep in mind that farewell addresses are given. Is this something of a farewell address that he is beginning to give to his disciples at the supper? Although the dialogue will go on for a number of chapters, and we will hear other sections of it in the upcoming weeks. But one remembers perhaps the farewell address that was given by Isaac, to his two sons, Esau and Jacob. Here are the words that are attributed. Be loving, he says, of your brothers as a man loves himself, with each man seeking for his brother what is good for him, loving each other as themselves. Now, why do I mention this? Because notice what we're going to hear in this section of the gospel this time. A new commandment I give you, says Jesus, that you love one another. All right, so perhaps keep in mind, loving one another. Who are the one another's that they are supposed to love? The disciples who are there. Now, I know that this is often extended to everyone, to all of us who listen to this. But if you think about it, the disciples are told to love one another as a group, because those outside will recognize the importance of what they are doing by this love that they show for one another. So in some way, loving one another commandment here is specifically to the disciples. Now we, as I just mentioned, extend this to, well, everyone who accepts Jesus' way, and we should love one another. But that's true. But what would make, and why is this particular section brought to bear at this particular point in the message that Jesus is giving to his disciple? That they continue, that is, the disciples, in loving one another, the divine love and mission that they have. One perhaps might notice that in this gospel, the disciples nowhere in the course of Jesus' ministry with them sends them out. Now, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have episodes where, remember, Jesus gathers his disciples and sends them out 2 by 2 to bring a message of the good news of the kingdom to others. That does not happen in John's gospel. There's no commissioning of the disciples to be missionaries, except that perhaps one can begin to find it here in this episode, where if, by the love that they show for one another, others will be inspired, and that's the way in which the message of Jesus will be shared and known. So you see, there's a lot of little different innuendos at work in this gospel. Love is extended at this point, as I mentioned, only to the inner circle, the community, that community, and not to the outside. You are my disciples if you love one another. Well, do they love one another? One would hope that by this time they have learned that by being these intimate disciples. Notice they are called the disciples of Jesus, not apostles here. God's love they are to show is very different from that which perhaps they have heard before. That's why this is called a new commandment. Because you might say, well, isn't the commandment, go back to Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, whole soul, and spirit, and love your neighbor as yourself. Isn't that that goes back to the Mosaic time. So what's new about what Jesus is saying? Well, put it in the context that we have just suggested, and there is the newness that is being brought to bear. All right, so all of this little section reminds Jesus, or Jesus rather reminds them, that even though perhaps they will not remain as faithful, now they are claiming to be willing to do that. And see, part is missing now that right after this you get the words of Peter, I will stay loyal with you regardless, etc., etc. But despite the weaknesses that the disciples might show in their actions, the love that Jesus has for them and the love, therefore, that God has for them remains firm, regardless of what they do. or what they don't do would probably be another way here. So all of this, you can kind of see the biblical background of thoughts from, as I mentioned, Isaac to his sons, or to Israel as it stood gathered at the Mount of Sinai, where God's glory is revealed to Israel. And now, and as I mentioned, this glory will be shown to all through the death and action of Jesus, and revealed in its fullness, again, on the cross. All right, let's just return a little bit now to the story that's found in the Acts. You remember last time, in the Acts of the Apostles, this is Luke's story of how the community of faith spreads. Paul and Barnabas have, at this point, are pictured in the section that we hear returning to places that they had been before. So they are going to return through places, I'm sure that you have these down on your map: Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, and Pisidia. To Pamphylia, they preach in Perga, and set sail to Attalia, which was the seaport on the coast of Pamphylia, to the base of Antioch on the Orontes. All right, you got all of that. Again, following what is characteristic of the Lucan thought of journey. Remember, we have noticed this on other occasions. So the journey that they began, they go back. Now why? Well, the thought is that they return to kind of strengthen the faith of those who have accepted the way of Jesus. Well, Luke kind of says strengthen. I smile and say maybe just to check up to see whether their teaching about Jesus has really caught on. And maybe what difficulties they have encountered because of their belief in Jesus. Now, there are a couple of terms. I guess this is an opportunity here to go through this. In verse 22, remember that we're looking at verses 21 through 27, it says, "It is necessary for us to undergo many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. All believers have to suffer in solidarity with the Messiah, Jesus, and his ministers in order to enter the kingdom." Now, suffer here is not the physical pains of the body. Certainly that is suffering, but that's not what's intended here. But it is suffering which will be incurred for professing and proclaiming the fact of Jesus' resurrection. God's reign, therefore, is not yet complete, and that's something that the writer Paul says in some of his letters, that we make up or fill up the suffering which is lacking. Now, the suffering that is incurred by proclaiming the good news of the gospel. It's important also to notice, as Luke presents it, that the apostles, and here he calls them apostles, are not independent messengers. They have been sent, and that any success that they have in proclaiming the good news about Jesus and the kingdom are to be attributed to God. It is not something they have done. It is difficult to know, as we look at this passage, what the governing model was in the time of Paul. We do know that Paul wrote a number of letters. 7 of them are what we call authentic Paul. It doesn't mean that the others aren't true, but it just means that they probably weren't written by Paul. And there's little indication in these letters as to how the structure of the life of the early church was to take place. He does speak about the fact that there are episcopi, that there are presbyteri, and that there are diakoni. Now, although there are these three titles, it's unclear what their role is, and it is unclear on what the relationship is between these three. It changes in what are called the Deutero-Pauline letters, which are the letters that we have attributed to Paul, but obviously were not written by Paul because the action in the letters takes place after Paul's death. And it is a little difficult to write letters once you're dead. So you can attribute the material to Paul. That's why, remember, we've noticed this. They are called Pauline letters. So even there does not remove the uncertainty of who is designated what to do. But the point is that in the Deutero letters of Paul, these three positions, bishop, presbyter, and deacon, are identified. Now, what exactly their relationship is, who is in charge, and what their duties are not clear. I mention all of this because when we look at, and that's what we're looking at, remember when we do these discussions, the writing of the Gospels or the writing of the material that appears in the Acts, that we are looking at the way in which the writers, community experience, perhaps their own understanding, saw things as taking place in their own time. And that perhaps is what is interesting, that when we look at the writing of John, well, as we've noted on a number of occasions, this work is written somewhere in the 90s, and maybe even flowing a little bit into the early part of the second century. So if we're having works written by the 90s, it's at least 60 years after the time of Jesus. So the whole imagery of Jesus, and that's what I've been kind of stressing a little bit this time, is that Jesus is, from the viewpoint of the Johannine Gospel, a strong and faithful, stoic stayer in the ways of the mission, rather, and message that he has been given by the Father to share. This unique, important relationship between Father and Son is stressed very strongly by the fourth gospel writer. And keep this in mind, that there's no question that when all is said and done, in this gospel, Jesus' divinity is clearly taught and understood. And this is a unique and important characteristic of the fourth gospel, not necessarily, as we have noted on some other occasions, as strongly affirmed in the other three, but because, and I conclude a little bit with this idea, because of the influence of the fourth gospel, particularly at the first great ecumenical council at Nicaea, and later at the Fourth Ecumenical Council, stresses the importance of the divineness of Jesus and his unique and close and intimate and personal relationship with the Father. All right, so keep in mind as we kind of continue to look a little bit at some of the thinking here of the Johannine Gospel, some of the things that are stressed this time, the importance of honor and the importance of the timing in which these works were written. Not that the message isn't true, and not that the message isn't helpful for us today, but some of the emphasis, perhaps, is a little bit different. Well, thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.